Shavua Tov. Today's daf is daf Chaf Aleph. And we'll start with the last few words on Chaf Amid Beis. Elakro limu'ute mai. So let's just remember that on daf Chaf, the Gemara had quoted a pasuk that starts with Karbanecha, which is a klal, and then goes on to Mincha, which is a prat, and then again a klal after the word Minchasecha. Again, carbon. And we have a principle called Ein Bichlal Ela Masha Befrat. So this klal, prat uklal, like any similar structure, is coming lemait. It's coming to exclude something in the context of melach. Right? The Torah says that you have to salt the carbon, but the Torah gives us a miut to tell us that not everything that goes on the Mizbeach requires salting. And initially, the Gemara thought on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph that this is coming to exclude eitzim. For example, in a case where someone takes upon himself a pledge to bring eitzim l'Mizbeach, that's called a carbon eitzim. And that's excluded from salting. And the reason for that is because it doesn't generate another burning of eitzim. It itself is burnt, as opposed to other karbanos, like, for example, a mincha, where after you are after you get the komets, after the kmitza, then the komets has to be burnt on the mizbech, so you're going to burn more wood, and it's coming to exclude dam, because dam, although it's part of a zevach and it's the main part of a zevach, but it's not similar to a mincha, and therefore it's excluded. But the only problem is that Rebbe is of the opinion that eitzim, in the case of a carbon eitzim, you do require malicha, and therefore, what is this prat coming to be mamayit? The Gemara says, "Elakrolamait mai ilam ute dam." If you want to exclude dam, then mi almin chasecha nafka. We've already derived from almin chasecha that dam is excluded, because we cannot interpret the prat klal uprat to exclude eitzim, because we're going like Rebbe. Rebbe holds that a carbon eitzim is basically like every other carbon. All the requirements apply, whether it's hagasha, whether it's malicha, everything applies to a carbon eitzim. And therefore, if salting applies to a carbon eitzim, we cannot use the klal pratu klal to exclude eitzim. So it seemed, therefore, that all we have to exclude is dam, but we don't need a klal pratu klal to exclude dam, because of another pasuk that says al min chasecha. So now we start daf Chaf Aleph. So the Gemara says, change the wording of the brisa, apik eitzim, take out the word eitzim, as if the brisa was excluding eitzim as far as malicha is concerned, because again, we're reflecting the Shita Rebbe that eitzim is a regular classic carbon that requires malicha. The aisle nisachim, and put in its place nisachim. Now nisachim, which are niske yayin, they also are not similar to a mincha, and therefore they're excluded from malicha, from salting. Why is it that nisachim are not similar to a mincha? Because again, as we said before, when you do the kmitza and then you maktir the komets, so you need eitzim to burn the komets. But in the case of niske yayin, you simply pour the yayin into what's called shitim. Shitim is where the yayin goes all the way down through sfolim, and there's no burning of any wood in the process of niske yayin. And now the Gemara is going to quote a brisa to show that niske yayin do not require salting. And therefore, again, the Gemara is now taking eitzim out, because again, we cannot exclude eitzim from salting, and instead we're going to put in niske yayin. The Sanya, we learned to the brisa, aval yayin v'adam v'eitzim v'aktoris ein te'unim melach. Now we're going to have a little bit of a problem here with this brisa, as the Gemara is going to point out, because the brisa excludes eitzim from malicha, from salting, and we know that according to Rebbe, eitzim is a regular carbon like a mincha and requires salting. On the other hand, the Chachamim, who reject Rebbe, and they hold that eitzim do not require salting, and they could be a candidate for the authorship of this price. But on the other hand, they hold that a ketoris requires salting. So Gemara says, Mani, according to which shita can we attribute this price? E Rebbe kasha eitzim, because Rebbe is of the opinion that a carbon eitzim is a classic carbon like mincha requires salting. E Rabbanan, if it's the Rabbanan who reject Rebbe, and they disagree and hold that eitzim does not require salting, but kasha ketoris. What are we going to do with ketoris? Because the Chachamim hold that ketoris requires salting. And the reason for that is because ketoris is burnt on the mizbeach. So we're going to need eitzim in order to burn the ketoris. And not only that, the ketoris is burnt on the mizbeach hachitzon. Well, that's actually not true. But what I mean to say, the salting is going to be done on the mizbeach hachitzon, and then they bring the ketoris inside the heichal to burn it on the mizbeach hapnimi. So therefore, the Chacham maintain that ketoris is included in the parsha of salting. And the Gemara now is going to be forced to introduce a third Tana, and that's going to be Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, Rabbi Shmuel beno shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, Hai Tanahu, a third Tana. This Sanya we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Shmuel beno shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omer, Ma haprat, what are we going to learn from the klal prat uklal, meaning the prat is mincha, and that's going to limit the application, or shall we say the requirement of malicha, of salting, to those karbonos that are similar to malicha. Similar to a carbon mincha. And now we're going to look at the elements of carbon mincha to define and circumscribe those karbonos that require malicha. Dover shemakabel tuma. Now let's understand. The komets is what's called an ochel. There are two categories of objects that can be makabel tuma. One is ochlin, food, and the other is kalim. And since a kometz is made of flour and oil, it therefore is edible. If it's an edible, it's an ochel and it's makabel tuma. Number two, ola leishim. Right, we take the kometz and we burn it on the mizbeach, on the fire. V'yeshno al mizbeach hachitzon, and the kometz is burnt on the mizbeach in the azara, the mizbeach hanachoshes. Is therefore the prat of mincha is going to teach me afkol, anything that fits this profile. Number one, it's a davar makabel tuma. Number two, it's ol ishim. Number three, it's yeshna mizbeach hachitzon. Then it requires salting. If it's lacking one of those three elements, then it's not similar to mincha, and it's excluded by virtue of the klal prat uklal, the prat being mincha, yotzu eitzim. Now let's understand, eitzim do not fit into either of the two categories that receive tumah. Number one, eitzim are not kalim, and number two, eitzim are not ochlin, they're not edible. Furthermore, yotzu dam v'yayin. Now, what's the problem with dam and yayin? Well, she'ein ola le'ishim. We take the dam and we apply it to the mizbeach, but we don't put it on the pyre. It's not burnt on the fire of the mizbeach. And in the case of yayin, meaning this yayin, that's not burnt on the mizbeach. As we said before, it's poured into the sfolim and then it goes down to the shita. Yotzu Ketores. Now we're going to say that there's no salting of Ketores against the Shita of the Chachamim. Why? She'ena al Mizbeach HaChitzon. Meaning, even though you can do the salting of the Ketores on the Mizbeach HaChitzon, but it's not burnt on the Mizbeach HaChitzon. The Ketores has a Haktorah on the Mizbeach HaPnimi, on the golden Mizbeach that's inside the Heichel. So therefore, this brisa that we just studied, that excludes salting in the cases of yayin, dam, eitzim, and ketores reflects the shita of Rabbi Shmuel ben Oshel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Now, all this is very good if you introduce Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, but since not everyone agrees with Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, we're still left with the outstanding problem of the klal prat u klal. El taima de mate kro ledam, holav hachi hava mina dam liboy melach. I don't get it, says the Gemara. You're telling me that according to other Tanoim, not Rebbe, like let's take Rabbi Shmuel, for example, the dam should require salting. Or even according to the Tanoim who say that dam do not require salting, that's only by virtue of a special yalfusa of a klal pratu klal. Frekting I don't understand. Keva de malchi nafkele mitoris dam. Once you salt the dam, it's no longer dam. And therefore, how could the Torah possibly require what was even the Havamina to include Malicha in dam? This dam is basically mayim; it's water as far as the mizbeach is concerned, and then you could never achieve kapar v'karban. The Omer Zeiri Omer Abchanina. Oh, now we get to Zeiri. Zeiri has a fascinating shita that dam shebishlo eno over alav. The Rabbi Yehuda Amar Zeiri, dam shemelacho eno over alav. The Torah says that if a person eats dam, they incur a chiyuv kares. We're talking about dam chulin. Comes along Zeiri, and he says that chiyuv kares for eating dam only applies to dam that's roy lemizbeach. If the dam was cooked or salted, it's no longer royal mizbech, and therefore, if you eat that dam, you do not incur a chiyuv kares. This is a fascinating idea that I wouldn't say often, but we've seen precedents where the laws of chulin will be determined by the laws of mizbeach. Whatever is royal mizbeach, for example, the Gemara in Bava Basra, the Rambam Paskas like that Yayin Lekidush, I wrote on this extensively in a book called Hagigi Oz, cannot be Yayin Lekidush, it's not qualified unless it's Royal Mizbeach. Here in Zeir, we're seeing the flip side, that in order to qualify as Dam for the Isser Kares of eating Dam, it's got to be Royal Mizbeach. So Bishlo or Molcho, if he added salt, it's not royal mizbeach, and therefore, if he added salt to the dam, then he would not get kares for eating that dam. So if somebody had a great desire to eat dam, which I'm not exactly sure why, maybe it's healthy, I don't know, then all he has to do is salt the dam. But that's not true, because the Rishonim here discussed that even according to Zeiri, there is an Isra achilas dam, just as no chiyuv kares. So we can't get away with it so easy. Anyway, Rabbi Yehuda Didei Omar, after Rabbi Yehuda quotes Ze'iri, he expresses his own view that a varim shetzla'on vehelon ein bohem mishum reach nichoach. One of the requirements of karbonos is got to be l'reach hanichoach. And Rabbi Yehuda says that if you have a limb of an animal after the shechita, that you want to bring it on the mizbeach, then if, let's say, you roasted it and brought it on the mizbeach, then it's not reich nichoach. In any event, getting back to Ze'iri, because that's our main focus here, Ze'iri says that dam that's salted is not dam, cannot be used on the mizbeach. It's not included under the prohibition of eating dam. And the Gemara now says, why then do I need to exclude malicha in the case of dam, when according to Ze'iri, the dam is no longer royal mizbeach? So for sure you can't salt the dam. Ma'al detema mishra be mashahu lemitzvah be'alma komashmala. How much salt does the Torah require in order to be makayim the mitzvah al kol karbonecha tochal melach? A minimum amount of salt. Maybe that minimum amount of salt would not passel the dam for the mizbeach. And therefore there was a havamina that you would be required to salt the dam, albeit with a very minimum amount of salt, such that the dam still retains its status as dam and its royal mizbeach. Kamash malon, therefore I need the equation to mincha, the klal patu klal, to exclude dam, or the word mincha secha in the Gemara's maskana, to exclude dam, and there's no malicha at all in dam, not even a minimum amount of malicha. Now, let's just point out one thing before we go on, and maybe this is more shaykh to the beginning of our discussion, and that is that even though, according to the other Tanoim that disagree with Rebbe, like Rabbanon, Eitzim can be equated. Eitzim are not to be equated, for those who argue against Rebbe, with mincha, because, as we said before, Eitzim do not require other Eitzim, but nevertheless, dam would be equated to mincha. And the reason for that, which is a point that's important, I didn't make it before, is because like the kmitza in mincha, which is matir the shirayim lachila, so too the dam, once you apply it to the mizbech, is matir everything else for achila, whether it be in the case of kachim for achilas kohen, whether it's kachim kalam for achilas zar. Okay, gufa. Omar Ze'iri, Omar Rab Chanina, Dam Shebishleina Overlov. Yosef Rava v'Ka'omer Leila Shmaita, Rava was transmitting this sugya of Ze'iri, that if you eat Dam Mevushal, then you do not incur a chiyuv kares, and the reason for that is because Dam Shebishlo is not royal mizbeach. Correct? That was Ze'iri. Abai was upset about this. Esrei Abai, hikvas adam. We have a brisa that says that if you heat up blood, v'acholo, and you eat it, shehimchas achelev, chelev also incurs a chiyuv kares, but he went ahead and he heated up the chelev and converted it into a liquid, ugmo, and he gulped down the liquid chelev, chayav. Despite the fact that he made these changes in the physical structure of dam or chelev, nevertheless, he's chayav, he gets kores. So we see from this brisa that the fact that if the dam was cooked or the chelev was liquefied, it is still included in the chiyuv kares, even if it's not royal mizbeach, even if it's disqualified for the Mizbeach, and that's against the Iri. The Iri says that if it's disqualified for the Mizbeach, then ipso facto, it is excluded from the Chi of Kares. Lokash. Says Rava, there's two categories of Hikvas Adam. Kansha Hikva Ba'or, Kansha Hikva B'chama. You could take dam and harden it in one of two ways. Either by heating it over the fire or by leaving it in the sun. And when the sun beats down and heats up the dam, it has somewhat of a change in the molecular structure of the dam, not a radical complete change. But in the case where he heats the dam on fire, that's going to make a profound change in the structure of the dam. And therefore, Zeiri would say that if he was hikvas adam bi'or, or meaning fire, then it's possible mizbech, and therefore you're not chayv kares. But if he allows the dam to harden, and just looking for another word for harden, solidify, but there's a better word that I can't think of now. Anyway, in the sunlight, that doesn't create such a profound change in the structure of the dam, and therefore it still is considered dam. Oh, so now the Gemara clarifies this. Be'or lo hodar, meaning if you heat up dam in the fire and then you allow it to cool off, it will not revert to its original state of dam. It will remain hardened dam. But if you heat up the dam in the sunlight, then give it a little time to relax. And when it cools off, it will now reestablish its original structure and its royal mizbeach, and therefore you will incur a chiyuv kares if you eat that dam. So when Rava gave this answer to Abai, Abai said, "B'chama nami lema hoil ve'idchi idchi." Abai said the following: I don't get it. You're telling me that the dam was hardened by the beating down of the sun, and now it cooled off. It goes back to being royal mizbech. We have a principle called dichui. Dichui means that something that's excluded for the mizbeach, even if the reason why it was excluded is removed, it does not go back to its original status, but rather hold the idchi idchi. Once it was excluded from the mizbeach, it's possible forever and ever. So how can you tell me that after it cools off from the sunlight, I can now use it as dam on the zrika of the mizbeach? And I'll prove it to you, says Abai, Haboy minei Rabbi Mani mi Rabbi Yochanan, dam shekorish v'acholo mao, amalei hol v'nidcha yidocha. That if the dam became hard, and then you softened it up, you could no longer use it on the mizbeach. And if you eat that dam, you're not chayiv kares for consuming that dam because hol ve'idchi idchi. It's excluded to the mizbeach, and therefore, ipso facto, it doesn't generate a chayiv kares if you eat it. Ishtik. Rava at that point threw in the towel. Amalei, Abai says to Rava, you know what? Maybe we could find a bit of an answer to this question. Dilma, vadai kan bechatos achitzonios, bekan bechatos hapnimios. You know what? Zeiri's case of where the dam became hardened and therefore it's excluded from this bath, he's talking about the chatos hapnimios. The chatos hapnimios means the par shel kohen gadol biyom kippurim, or the soyer shel kohen gadol biyom kippurim, and there all the sprinklings are done on the paroches in the heichal, and that's called the chatos hapnimis, and the inner chatos. The Torah is so much more machmir and stringent about the requirements of an inner chatos that therefore, in the case of an inner chatos, the dam, once it becomes hardened, says the Iri, is completely and irreversibly disqualified from the Mizbeach Hazov, the Mizbeach HaPnimi. But in the case of Chatas Chitzona, that's where you quoted that other brisa to prove that if you can reverse the situation, it was hard, then now you can bring it back to its original state, then it's kosher mizbeach. Omar. So Rava was very happy, gave a thumbs up, to this defense of his original position. You know what? You jolted my memory. I now remember a statement of Reb Chisda that dam shekosh b'chatos hachitzonus v'chol chayav. That Rav Chizkiah is going to derive from an exegesis of psukim in the Torah that if you're talking about a regular classic chatos chitzona, then enochinami. Once it was karash, it became hard, coagulated. That was the word I was looking for. Finally popped into my brain. Then if it becomes uncoagulated, meaning you cool it off, and it goes back to its original state, then it's kosher mizbeach, and we're going to derive that from a pasuk, because the pasuk says v'lokach v'nosan amar rachmana, hai bar lekicha unesinahu. The Torah went out of its way to say that the nesinas hadam on the mizbeach is similar to v'lokach, and that means that as long as you could do a lekicha, for example, you had dried blood, and I can still do a lekicha on it, is then if he eats that dam, he's chayav because that dam is royal mizbeach. But bechatas hapnimis acholo potter. Why? Because it's not royal mizbeach. Why is it? With regard to a chatas pnimis that we spoke about, the sprinklings on the parochas, etc., there the Torah says v'tovel etzbo badam. He's got to dip his finger into the blood. The blood has to be in a liquid state such that when he picks up his finger, he's got dam dripping off his finger, and he does the zrika, the hazoya, on the parochas. So therefore, if he eats that dam, because the dam now became hard and it's not roy le toval v'hisa, Omer Rachmana, hai lav bar tefila v'azo. Right? It's now you can't dip his finger in and then sprinkle it out. It's hard dam, it's coagulated dam. So therefore, you see that Rav Chisda is accepting what Abai came up with as well, a fundamental distinction between two categories of chatos. There's the chatos hapnimius, and then there's the chatos hachitzonos. And the nafkamina is going to be this coagulated dam, which is excluded from the mizbeach in the case of a chatos pnimis, but is included in the mizbeach of the chatas chitzona, meaning the outer mizbeach in the azara, and therefore if you eat it, you're chayiv kares. Now all this was an analysis of Ze'iri. Now Rava says, I want to say my own. And this opinion of Rava in the context of Ze'iri is very, very revolutionary. Rava Didei Omar, he himself, Afilu b'chatas pnimis v'achol chayev. I'm going to tell you that even though the dam of a chatas pnimis is completely disqualified once it coagulates, nevertheless, if he eats it, he's chayev. Why? Because although that dam is disqualified for chatas pnimis, roy b'chatas chitzonios, it still is in the general constellation of dam haroy l'mizbeach. Why? Because although in a chatas pnimius it's excluded, but it would not be excluded in the case of a chatas chitzona. So Rav is sort of climbing up to the abstract world, up in the Luftarain, and he's saying that since this dam could, in a different formulation, if it came back and resurrected in a different form, as a chatas chitzona, would be royal mizbeach. Therefore, if you eat it, you chayv chatas, you chayv kares. Amar of Papa, wait a second. If we're accepting Rava, then let's go one step further. Hilkach, dam chamor, right? Now, a chamor is a non-kosher animal, and it's certainly not royal mizbeach. You can't take the dam of a chamor and any non-kosher animal and put it on the mizbeach. Shekorash, viacholo, chayav. Now again, when we're saying chayav, we're not saying that he's chayav just because it belongs to a non-kosher species like a chamor, but we're saying that he's chayav for eating dam. Now, the dam of a chamor, with all due respect, is not royal mizbeach. If we went with Zeiri's approach, for sure he would not be chayiv kores for eating dam. He'd be chayiv malchus maybe for eating a part of a chamor, but not for the iser of eating dam. But now, according to Rava, says Rav Papa, that since, according to Rava, we look for the possibility of using it lemizbeach, why chayiv hol ukenegdo roy bechatos achitzonos. What does that mean? We're going to say now that when he eats the dam of a donkey, pardon the expression, of a chamor, Rav Papa is going to say that according to Rav Yischai, why? It's karash. We're talking about a case where the dam was karash, and therefore dam shekorash, once it coagulates, it's not royal mizbech. But the answer is, says Rav Papa, it is royal mizbech. It's roy for a chatos chitzona. Obviously, you can't take this dam from a donkey and put it on the mizbech. But since in theory, conceptually, there is dam shekorash, which is royal mizbech in the case of a chatos chachitzona, therefore he's not chayav for eating the dam of a chamor because it's royal mizbeach, meaning if it wouldn't have been a donkey, it would have been royal mizbeach, even though it's karash. So the karash, the hardening of the dam, does not exclude it from the mizbeach. Rav Gido Mezeiri dam bein lach ubein yovesh chotzetz. If a person jumps into a mikveh to be metar himself, he can't have anything separating his body from the water of the mikveh, and now he's got blood on his body. So the blood on his body, says Rav Gidel, is a chatzitza, separating his body from the water of the mikveh. And it doesn't matter whether the dam is in its original liquid state, or even if it dried up. Meisvei, the Gemara says, Now let me just point out that Rav Gidel is formulating this rule in the name of Zeiri. And this, in a certain sense, fits in very well with, just one second, with Zeiri's original classification of dam, because according to Zeiri, even if it's dam sheyovesh and the blood was hardened, nevertheless, it could still be royal mizbeach, and therefore it still has a shem dam, and therefore it could be a chatzitza. Anyway, Meisvei, the Gemara asks the following question. The Brisa states that Adam vadio vadrash v'acholov yiveshim chotzim lachim einam chotzitzim. We see that this Brisa, as far as the law of chatzitza, is making a fundamental distinction between dam yavesh and dam lach, that in the case of lach, if it's still moist, then the water will just simply wash away the dam immediately when his body comes in contact with the water, and therefore it's not a chatzitza. And the only dam that's a chatzitza, according to this brisa, is going to be dam sheyavesh, dam that hard. Then we have dio, we have dvash, we have chol, fine. So this is against Zeiri, because Zeiri said that even in the case of lach, it's not, I'm sorry, even in the case of lach, it does constitute a chatzitza. Here we're saying that in the case of lach, there is no chatzitza. Lo kasha. Hadesirach, hadelo sarich. It all depends upon the state of the dam, right? The dam, even if it began to get dry, but still it's mostly wet and it's mostly a liquid in its form, and it's not a chatzitz, even according to Zeiri. Zeiri was talking about a case where the dam reached a more advanced stage of dryness. It's sticky. That's called sarich, and therefore when he goes down to the mikveh, the water is not going to wash away the dam because the dam is really sticking to his skin. Now the Gemara wants to know the following. We worked very hard to determine the exclusion of the klal pratu klal. But what about the word timlach? Lemay osa. In the pasuk itself, it says kol korban. That's the beginning of Vayikra. It says kol korban minchascha v'melech timlach. Why the double language? Melach timlach. So Gemara says, look at Asanya Melach. If it had only said the word Melach without the word timlach, then Yachol Tvonehu. Okay, Tvonehu is going to come up in the Gemara exactly what it means. Well, let's just assume Tvonehu means Miloshen Binyan. It's like a building. Anyway, Talmud Lomar Timlach. Okay, fine. We're going to get back to this soon. E Timlach. Now that we have the pasuk Timlach, why do we need Melach? Yachol b'mei melach, Talmud Lomar ba melach. So, as you know, if you go down to the Dead Sea, you will see salt water. Water that's very heavily salt, the ingredients of salt. And now the question is, can you just simply take that salt and use it for this obligation of salting the korbanos? So the Torah has a separate word that it adds as a miut, ba melach. It's not enough to take out a scoop of water from the Dead Sea. You need melach mamish, actual melach. Now the pasuk goes on and says, "V'lo tashbis melach bris elokecha." What do we learn from that? Havei melach she'ena shoveses. It means salt that is available the whole year round. V'ezo zu melech stomis. Okay, from stone, which means from the Dead Sea. So you could find salt in the Dead Sea water the whole year round. Uminayin shem lo motza melach stomish, maybe melach istrokonis. So there's another kind of salt that's called istrokonis. And although that's not really the right salt to use, it's coarse grained salt in contrast to stomite salt. It has to be mined and processed. And you cannot do the mining in all the seasons under all the conditions. And therefore, it should not be used, but we're going to derive from an extra ribui that b'di'eved, if you use that kind of salt called istrokononis, comes from that area of the world, then you yotze, you fulfilled the mitzvah. Talmud Lomar takriv kolshu. So takriv is now a klal, as we said before, to include everything. And here it's going to include even the salt that's mined during certain seasons. Takriv mikol makom. Oh, now we have another drasha from the word takriv, because again, the word takriv is a klal, so it comes to include salt that's imported from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael, and takriv afilu b'Shabbos. So we have what's called Ola Shabbos Shabbatos, certain karbonos that have to be brought on Shabbos. You will salt those karbonos. There's a long discussion about this because salting is not a malacha in the 39 malachas. I don't know why I need a ribui. That's a discussion. But takriv afilu b'tuma. So what does afilu b'tuma mean? He says here, afilu b'tuma, even in a state of tuma. So it means that the salt was makabel tuma, and yet it could still be used on the mizbeach. I mean, it's a pellet. Don't know. Okay. Now let's get back to that very ambiguous word, tivonehu. My. Amar Rabba hula hachika. We're going to have one opinion of Rabba in interpreting this word, yochel yisbonenu. Right? Yisbonenu is like a word from the construction uh, area, meaning when you add, to make bricks, you add teven, just one second, straw, right? Teven is straw, to clay. So you have to add a lot of teven, a lot of straw to the clay in order to make a brick. So therefore, yachol, I might think tevoneu, that when you apply salt, you got to apply very, very heavy salt. And the mushal is like the heavy dosage of straw that's added to the clay. Talmud Lomar, and therefore we have a ribui that's not necessary. Okay. Now we have another opinion of Tmonehu. Right? It should have said like build it in the future, build it like by adding a lot of salt. That maybe he has to put the salt on one level and then on top of it another level of salt and then on top of that another level of salt, like a building. And for that we need a special reboot. Amalei Rava. Rava doesn't like Abai's interpretation. He says, if that be the case, again, your syntax is not accurate. Yivnenu mi boile. You know, Yochel, I might think that you have to build it up by adding one. Elam, a Rava Yochel tivunehu. Tivunehu is miloshem bina. That means wisdom. My tivunehu. Amar Rav Ashi, this is what Rava had in mind. Yochel yite botam kibina. In other words, there's an imbecile who doesn't know anything, and then there's Bina. Bina means he reaches the barest level, the minimum level of understanding, and then he can understand things. And therefore, in the case of salt, we only need a bit of salt, a small amount of salt. Tamid Lomar, Timlach, no, we need a larger amount of salt. Kesed hu oseh. Now the Brisa wants to interpret how exactly does he proceed in salting the korban? Number one, mevi ha'ever. Right now, after the shechita of the korban, you have limbs of the animal that have to be burnt on the mizbeach. Bring a limb of the animal, no sin of melach, but it's not enough to put the melach on the top, but rather chosev v'hovcha v'no sin of melach. You have to turn it upside down and put the melech on the other side of the limb, and then you put it onto the mizbeach. So I don't know, Rabbosai, have any of you wonderful gentlemen ever seen salting of meat? My mother, may she rest in peace, used to salt, how do you say, kaved, livers. I mean, the whole house used to smell, don't ask. But anyway, but I haven't seen that in about 65 years, something like that. So salting is not a common kind of thing. But if you salt a piece of meat, the purpose of which is to remove the dam, then you have to salt on both sides. You have to turn over the meat to the other side. And speaking of the other side, now we're going to turn on the page to the other side of the page.